Hello, hi. I'm Elizabeth Bohun. I'm a project manager for the Oxford Go Ultralow Cities funded scheme. We've called it Go Ultralow Oxford, imaginatively. As previously mentioned, it's really focused on-street residential charging, particularly something that we have an issue with in Oxford. So a bit of a background for those of you that don't know Oxford, that anyone who hasn't been there before, it's a beautiful city, you should all come. So why do we need ultra-low emission vehicles? Well, it's very much similar to lots and lots of other cities around the UK, around the world. We're a city that's trying to move towards sustainable transport. We got the UK's first low emission zone outside of London. We've got really high patronage of active cycling, active transport and public transport. We still see that we have high levels of nitrogen dioxide in the city. We've got a growing economy, a growing population with a lot of in-commuting, which leads to high congestion, and we think that this is really contributing to some really high levels of nitrogen dioxide being recorded in the city. We definitely see that we're breaching the mean targets, and we've had some source apportionment studies done a number of years ago which revealed that actually cars are contributing a lot towards this, and on some major roads or main link roads, when you take out buses, cars are right up there as being, or private cars are right up there as being the main source of nitrogen dioxide that we're seeing in the city. So in order to try and combat this, we set out our low emission strategy in 2014 with our targets for a cleaner, greener Oxford, involving ultra-low emission vehicles. We see that as part of the jigsaw of making Oxford a cleaner and greener city. And you may have seen recently in the press that we've now announced plans for a zero emission zone in the city centre. Plans which are still in development. We're working very closely with our Transport Authority, Oxfordshire County Council, to make these things happen. We've just completed a consultation with local residents and businesses, and so we're reviewing all the responses that we've had back. Very surprisingly, we had a really high response rate for a local authority consultation of nearly 1,000 responses. So that's something that we think indicates that people are really interested in what we want to do. Whether that's positive or negative responses, we'll find out. But that's something that we're working on at the moment. So, Go Ultralow Oxford is a project which has been grant funded by the Office for Low Emission Vehicles as part of their Go Ultralow City scheme. It's a major trial of on-street electric car chargers, specifically focused on people living in streets where perhaps there are terraced houses where there's no off-street parking. 28% of our population live in these kind of properties. We also have a lot of flats in the city where people also don't have off-street parking. But this project is focusing specifically on areas like you might see here with terraced houses. We actually have in the city a proportion of our population that really fit the profile for early EV adopters, but we're still relatively low in comparison to other cities in terms of uptake. It's actually less than 1%, quite a lot less than 1%, and we think that our housing situation is one of the obvious barriers. We carried out some market research when we were developing our bid for the Go Ultralow Cities scheme, and found that people that we were targeting in terraced areas, those who felt that they would be keen to move over to an electric or plug-in vehicle, 75% of those people were parking on the street. So you can see immediately there's an obvious barrier that's preventing these people from making that switch. So our project is really based around trials and research. We're working with the University of Oxford's Transport Studies Unit and the Centre for Innovation and Energy Demand. We're trialling 6 different types of chargers, which I'll go into in the next slide. And what we're doing is recruiting volunteers from across the city. We've got 20 private residents who are trial volunteers. We're also working with Co-Wheels Car Club, who are testing out 10 of our installations as well, so that we can gather some user experience, understand behaviour change, and as well as looking at efficiency of the hardware itself. And we know these things should technically work, but what we really, really want to understand is how they actually fit into people's lifestyles, how they adapt, and how these new technologies fit into the urban environment. So a little bit about the different technologies that we're trialling. They sort of broadly fit into 3 different categories. We've got lamp column charging. So obviously the major advantage of that is that it's really low cost. We're not having to dig up the road, which cuts out huge amounts of money. We're not having to create new energy supplies. So that means that we're cutting out a lot of the time that's taken working with DNOs and liaising with them, and the cost that comes up when you start fitting a new power supply. Most of them fit into the lamp column door. We've got 2 different types of lamp column charger that we're using. So this one you can see up the top here has already been trialled in a number of boroughs in London. We're trialling it. It's from Ubitricity, and this is a technology that is slightly different from other standard charging points that you might see around. All of the communications and the metering happens within the cable. And so this is this smart cable, which is owned by the user. And so all the billing is done through the back office, which is connected to this cable. The sockets themselves are called simple sockets because they're very simple. They're only activated when the cable is used, so there's no risk of energy theft. But there's no communications there happening through the cable. It's only active when the cable is plugged in. The second lamppost charger that we're using is this one here, which is a lot more similar to a standard post that you might see. It does fit onto the lamp column. The power supply is taken from the lamp column, but all of the comms and the metering happens in this box here. So it's a lot more similar. At the moment, we are struggling a little to get through some difficulties with the metering and energy regulations at the moment, which mean that we would have to install an approved meter inside this very small cabinet here. So that's something that we're working on at the moment. We don't have any of these installed yet. We think we've found a solution that will work for us. There's also discussions going along with Elexon and with BEIS in central government to help these kind of technologies move forward nationally at a national level. The second kind of technology that we're looking at is something very, very basic, very, very simple, cable channels, which will run across the pavement to allow residents to lay their charging cable into the slot so it can be safely out of the way whilst they're charging. They can use that with a home charger, and they can access their own home energy supply, getting access to really, really good low rates of cost when it comes to charging. So that's where people can still access the same 2 pence per mile EV driving that you see sort of quoted for people who've got home chargers at home. The main proviso with these cable channels is that we're not able to provide a dedicated charging bay. If we did that, in essence, we'd be privatising a section of the highway, and so people who want to take on this technology and trial it have to be confident that they'll be able to park outside their own home, and that obviously doesn't work for everybody. So that's one of the things that we're hoping we'll get some really interesting results on how this works, where it might work, and what kind of profile people might need to fit into in terms of their work and their driving patterns that will make this work. So the final type of charging that we're using is fairly straightforward. 3 different types of freestanding columns. They're very similar to what you might see in a car park or elsewhere. They are slimline and specially designed for being used and installed on street. They will be paired with an EV charging space, and they will be available for any member of the public to access. So we've actually completed the first round of interviews with our trial volunteers. We found some interesting results in terms of the sort of softer side of the research that we're doing. These people have been interviewed before they started using the chargers, and we found that there are some quite interesting overlaps with our trial volunteers in terms of their interests, events that have happened in their life, and the build-up to them switching over to an electric vehicle. And we definitely see, for example, that lots of our trial volunteers have got a technical background, and they are interested in cars, which we think means that they're still falling into that early adopter section of the EV driving community. There's a lot of people who have got an environmental interest, and we also see that lots of people are using this trial as a way of experimenting, and that plug-in hybrid vehicles are the things that they're choosing to experiment with. It does give them a sense of security that if they're not able to charge, they still have the backup of the hybrid style vehicle. So that's the sort of profile that we're seeing from our trial users at first. I've put in one of these pictures here to demonstrate that what people will resort to if they don't have access to some way of charging at home. So you can see they've got a little handmade cone there to warn people that there's a cable across the pavement. And so this is exactly the sort of thing that we really want to try and avoid, and that hopefully we'll be able to resolve when we've finished our trials. So moving on to some of the lessons that we've learned from our work developing the project, quite outside of the interviews that we've been doing with our trial subjects. Some of the things that we've really felt were particularly interesting, challenging to move through with the project were around contracting models, and how we set up ownership of the charging equipment, how we ensure that it's managed and maintained in the background. And what we have differs slightly from the model that we see in Scotland, where you have a nationally procured back office, in that we're sort of left to our own devices to find our own back office provider. The route that we've taken is to look for a concession. We maintain full ownership of all the chargers that are being installed as part of this project, but because the resources required to manage and maintain them ourselves would be too demanding for a local authority of our size, we've decided to look for a concessionaire who would manage and take control of all of the maintenance, back office, energy contracts, and the recouping the costs of charging from our residents. I think that's something which also differs slightly from what you might see in Dundee, where charging is still free. We're actually going in straight away and charging people to cover the energy and the management of the system in the background. And the reason for this, resources, the OLEV grant that we received is purely capital funding, so it would be very difficult for us to contract someone to come in and do these services using capital money. And we also see that there is a revenue sharing opportunity for us. Any revenue that comes in from the charging points, we've been able to secure a contract where we will take a portion of that, which we can then set aside for future projects or for renewing the infrastructure as it ages. So the impacts of this decision that we've made is that we do have more choice on the type of hardware that we want to install. I realise I'm going a little bit too slowly, so I'll whiz through the next few slides. We've got more choice on hardware. We do have to think a lot more about integration, so OCPP 1.5 has been absolutely critical. We need to provide public access to make the business case stack up for anyone that's managing this, so we couldn't do this and have this arrangement if we were purely keeping those charges for our residents. And we've also looked at having variable tariffs so that our residents can have a better price than people coming in from out of town and using the chargers, which we want to, in a way, discourage to avoid increasing the traffic burden in the city. Procurement, we went through an open OG procurement and decided to separate the supply and installation of the charging equipment from the procurement of a concessionaire to run the back office. And this was really because we had specific technologies of interest. And one of the things that we felt was a lesson that we'd learned particularly from this is around interoperability and how that's lacking in the UK market. We really felt that we had to go back and look at our critical values and decided that actually best value for users and public money was something that was really important to us. And we felt that some of the offers that we received from the UK market were falling short of that. And so we had to think very, very carefully about how to tackle that. It's not something I'll go into in too much detail up here, but if anyone wants to chat about it, I'm always very happy to talk about our experiences with procurement. Moving on quickly just through the EV charging bays, we found that traffic regulation orders were something that's been a real challenge. It's a time-consuming process. We needed them because of the residential use case to make sure that people were able to charge overnight at slower speeds and that we could prioritise our residents. We did have to go through the TRO consultation, and engagement was something which was really, really critical around that. We found that the TRO consultation documents which were being used to do the consultation for the bays themselves weren't broad enough in their engagement, and so that the information that people were receiving didn't include things like signage, the amount of signage that was going to be there, what the charging points were going to look like, and people had opinions about those things. And so we think that when we are moving on to roll this out across the city at a larger scale, a wider consultation remit is going to be absolutely critical for us to get things through. I might skip that one and move on to the next steps. So moving on from this, after we finished our trial stage, we're going to be looking at citywide expansion with up to 100 new solutions installed across the city out of the selection of trial equipment that we're installing. We're definitely looking at using the evaluation that we've got from our trial to inform this choice. And we're also thinking very, very hard about whether to take a strategic approach to installing across the city or whether to bring in some demand-led installations. We know that demand-led is very responsive. It can really help to get things into the right places. However, we've found that the process has been quite extended, moving from getting an initial response from a resident who wants a charger installed through to actually getting things installed can take about 9 months or longer, and that means that people get impatient and that you're not able to plan in a more strategic manner to cover the best area and take on things like a whole street approach. So we're definitely thinking very hard about mixing strategic and demand-led approaches when we move on. I think that's all about what we do have some time. Thank you very much, and if anyone has any questions, then I'll answer.
Can I ask what wattage your chargers are in Ultralow? Is it Type 2 connectors?
Yep, all Type 2 Menicus connectors, yeah, across the board. That's the standard that's being asked for from OLEV.
So you give them 22 volts. Fast chargers?
Oh, sorry, yes, they are, no, they're not 22, they're all 7.4 or lower, depending on the lamp posts. We have to downgrade the power that goes in there to 5 kilowatts because of the capacity of the cables coming into the lamp columns.
Many of the lampposts in this city are not at pavement side, but the other side because of bashing. Is it the same?
Yes, yeah. So in Oxford, our local transport authority, the county council, have currently got in place a policy where they will move all lampposts to the rear of the pavement, away from the road, and that's been sort of attributed partly to reducing the risk of damage from cars, and also partly to providing better disability access. That's something that we need to look at, because clearly if you're moving all of the lampposts to the back of the pavement, but you still need EV charging, you're putting in more street furniture. And so where there's been a policy of trying to declutter, we might actually be missing out on opportunities to use the lamp columns. So that's something that we're having discussions about, particularly when we're thinking about the rollout. We've managed to find enough for our trial that are still in the right location, but it's something that definitely, and I think it's nationwide, that there are these kind of policies happening across the whole country. So it's definitely a discussion that needs to be had at a national level.
And I have fears that the standalone ones look like cigarette put-out. Does anybody else have that feeling? That would be a fear.
Yes, well, I mean, they come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes, and we, yeah, you do see, they're not always apparent exactly what they are, so signage is something which is really important, I think, to making things look like what they are. We do also in Oxford come up against heritage conservation and conservation areas, and so there are some areas in the city where we will need to put in columns that look like sort of Victorian heritage style bollards, which might prove difficult for people trying to find a charger. So that there's a balance between these things. One of my colleagues had a brilliant suggestion of putting a charger inside something that looks like an old-fashioned red pillar box, which nobody seems to have done yet out there in the industry, but we think it would look great, and certainly would allow us to put things outside St John's College, which we couldn't do at the moment because it just wouldn't fit in.
Fantastic. We have time for one more quick question. Doug.
Thank you very much indeed, Elizabeth. Doug Robertson, Electric Vehicle Association of Scotland. Two questions for you. How do you stop internal combustion engine cars blocking the lanes? And two, have you tried multi-storey car parks like Bohun?
Well, number one, we are going to be using our enforcement officers. The structure of the traffic regulation orders means that during the daytime it'll be a 3-hour maximum stay, and vehicles will have to be plugged in to be allowed to be in the space. So we're relying at the moment on our people on the street, doing their job and finding people. I know that there are chargers out there or bits of kit out there that will tell you if something's in the space and if it's not plugged in. That's not something that we've been able to bring into this project, but we know that it's happening elsewhere across the country, so we're looking at that for kind of potential future development. Second question was multi-storey car parks. Actually, the City Council doesn't own any multi-storey car parks. Our new shopping centre, the Westgate Centre, has just been opened. It's privately owned and run, and they have installed EV charging in their car parks. But that's not something that I've been involved in.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.